Hey, hi. I'm CHILLYBUS, and I think I have enough of a grasp on split planing and chunking to maybe make a tutorial video here. Hopefully this is helpful. If not, well, then I guess you're gonna have to figure this out for yourself. Um, if you have not watched all of Luke Schneider's tutorials, I highly recommend doing that. He covers most of the basics and helps you actually design a level. This is more or less at the end of publishing your first, well, any level really. But when this is after you've done all your geometry, all your texturing, all your decal work, and most of your entities. That's stuff like player starts, lighting, most of your items, robots, things of that nature. This is not quite right before you're ready to publish. It shouldn't be your dead last step because you're going to make lighting tweaks based off of what you see here. But this is on the checklist for the last things you're gonna do before you actually send the map out. So what are split planes and what are chunks? Well, chunks define a lot about the lighting in the Unity engine as Overload has it. Things like shading, things like reflections, stuff like that. Chunks are essentially giant rectangular prisms. I know that's not what they're called in English, but stretched cubes, things of that nature, sort of like segments. And they contain all of that stuff for a certain part of the level. Um, Usually it's pretty big, well, chunks, large clusters of segments, but it can be as small as a single segment. We'll go over that in a bit. How do we make these chunks? Well, that's where split planes come in. These are essentially the sides of every chunk, and the editor can sort of interpret the split planes and make its own decisions about where the borders of a chunk are. But for the most part, split planes are going to be the faces of your chunks. So, how do we visualize this? Well, you're going to go over here to the perspective, view option, and you're going to click through until it says chunks, and you should come up with something sort of similar to this. From there, you're going to hit F5 if there's no color applied. F5 will redo all of the chunks. It'll recalculate the borders of all of them in your level. And then you're going to click in that window, and you should see it change color. Now, if you keep doing that, it'll keep changing the color. A color is assigned randomly to every single chunk in every level you make. So every time you hit F5, you get a new palette. That's in case, two chunks next to each other have a very similar shade of blue or red or something like that. It's just to help you out, essentially, in seeing these. Before we jump into this, we need to know about split plane ordering. This is where we're going to, this over here on the right, under selected side, it says split plane order. That's where we're going to assign our split planes for a particular segment face. So we're going to grab this one right here. And we're going to start with a 0. Now, a 0 is the most powerful split plane. That is going to not intersect, it's going to stop, essentially, every split plane of a higher order than 0. Anything that isn't 0 is going to get stopped by a 0. A 0 is a very... It's a plane in the geometric sense. It is a 2D object that goes forever. It'll just cut through everything, geometry, lights, players, objects, decals, you name it. It will go through it. So we've put down a 0, as you can see on this face right here. We're going to cut off this room here. Now, what I usually like to do with my first split planes, or just split planes in general, when I'm starting to put them down on a map, is isolate large chunks, no pun intended, of a level. So that's going to be this room right here. So we've put that down. We're going to hit F5 to recalculate all the chunks, and then we're going to click once. And then you'll see this is purple, this is blue. Those two are kind of close together. We'll hit F5 again just to really show the difference off. Now this is a dark green and this is a light blue. So this, all in here, is its own chunk. You can kind of envision a rectangular prism or stretched cube going from this face right here at its maximum extent, the top of this segment up here, so all the way over, and then down on the most outside face, and then all the way to the bottom, and then it is as wide, see if we can see it here, as this room. So that is all its own chunk. And ideally, you don't want these to intersect. You're going to get something called chunk pop, or you're going to have reflection issues, or you're going to have lighting issues. It's just going to look a little weird. Some chunk pop is very subtle. some chunk pop can't be noticed, and then some chunk pop is really terrible, where it'll grab the afterburner off of someone's ship or a robot's engine when it's calculating a reflection probe as a chunk turns on, and it'll, blow everything up. It'll be pretty strange. But for now, we're just gonna leave this here. We're gonna consider that its own chunk. Let's move over here. This will require a little more finesse. This tunnels in general are pretty good candidates to make some of your first chunks, just to really get those out of the way. So we're gonna put down a 2. Now a 2 is stopped by a 1, a 0, and all geometry in the level. So, because this is a doorway, this edge up here, this edge down here, and both edges on the sides will stop that split plane. So we're gonna do the same on the other side of the hallway. We're gonna hit F5, and you'll notice this has become its own chunk now. Now this is bounded by the sides of the doorways, the top of this segment, all the way over to here, where it hits this geometry, the back of this wall, comes down to the very bottom of this segment, and then all the way back over to, envision essentially this plane coming down here, and then all the way back up to here. So it's a rather thin chunk, but you can kind of envision, a rectangular prism encapsulating all of these segments. It's okay that chunks go into void space, I think is the term. That's totally fine. That is by design. Let's move into this room here. We're gonna put down a 1, and that's gonna split a lot more geometry. A 1 is fairly powerful. I usually use these for the middle of rooms. You're gonna see this will isolate this trench here. The bottom of that chunk is right there, and then the top of it is where we designated. It's as wide as the trench is, and it's as deep as the trench is. Let's keep putting split planes down. This is not exactly a hallway, but choke points are also pretty good candidates. So we're gonna put down 2s here, because we might want to put down another one up here. And a 1 would be powerful enough to divide this hallway. A 2 still might. Some of this requires a bit of finesse. You might get weird results. Let's keep hitting F5. So this is divided cleanly. This down here is not split, so let's move up here. We're gonna put down a split plane of 2. That divides this room off. Now, I kind of try to avoid doing this, but I think if I were to put down another split plane elsewhere, it would sort of mess this up. I generally try to avoid putting down a split plane on an angled segment face. I feel that it sort of corrupts the nature of borders between chunks. It creates a little bit of chunk pop. It's just a little bit goofy. But for here in this instance, that's okay. We're just trying to get the point across. If you're working on your own level, you're going to have a lot more time to sort of work things out. I'm going to do the same over here. Just going to put down a 2. Split plane ordering goes all the way up past 20. I've never used over 3 in most of my levels. I think that's more or less the same for most folks. A lot of people don't go above 1 or 2. It requires a little bit of finessing. It requires a little bit of trial and error. You might have to go back through and see, oh, this tunnel here is split. What can we do to sort of fix that? Well, let's try putting down a 2 so that is cut off there, and then that is cut off there. Yeah, even those split planes don't really mitigate it. So let's turn these down to 1. Now that'll work just fine. So this tunnel, for instance, now, it took a little bit of poking at it, but we were able to isolate that into its own chunk, where the bottom is the bottom edge of this, the top is the top edge of this one, and then there is a cleanly isolated rectangular prism that encapsulates all of these segments, and that is your chunk. Now you'll notice this has been a little bit busted up, so let's put down some 1s here, see if that fixes anything. That's a 2, and a 1 here doesn't. Sometimes you'll notice symmetry doesn't really work out too well with this. Again, you might have to just redo things entirely. So To do that, you're going to go to the random menu and then hit clear split planes, and then I'll get rid of everything, hit F5, and they're all gone. So that's sort of the process behind iterating on split planes. I'm just going to redo some of these to sort of show off a fast iteration of it. So we've got that isolated, and then we went here, and then we put down a 1. Now that we're back at this point, I kind of want to talk about decorative geometry and superstructures. Superstructures are, you know, what I consider to be geometry outside the level that people aren't going to interact with, but might be larger than the level itself. They might encapsulate a huge area, or it might be a skybox or something like that. Those I generally tend to isolate first using split planes and chunks. Here I did not do that because these are not traversable, and the only parts of it you're going to realistically see is up to about here. These are just extra segments in case people can really get a weird perspective somehow. Since these are single unit wide, the Kodachi will never be able to traverse up here, so the lighting is kind of irrelevant what it looks like up there. That might make things a little bit strange down here, in which case, you know, we'd put up an extra split plane over here. We'll put down a 0 perhaps, and that'll isolate just this back wall and all of these. And even that might be a little bit strange. So then we'd go in here and put down another 0, and then that hasn't really cut through the void space too effectively, so we just put down more and more until, you know, all of that is cut off properly. Let's see. That's, I think, about it. Now that I'm considering it, I generally try and avoid putting down split planes in adjacent segments across open areas. Adjacent segments generally, I just try and avoid putting split planes down on. So like this, that wouldn't be effective. I believe these are calculated as the same split plane, but there's still some strange effects sometimes if you put down split planes like that. See, we put down a 1 there, and then this is its own chunk. And then, let's see, this is its own chunk as well. Stuff like that. Again, it takes a lot of trial and error. It's almost more art than science. It's really up to you what you want these to look like. Quick word about numbering these chunks, not, you know, assigning a number to each one, but the number that you should have. I've had as few as 1 for the sub-rosa port. That is all a single chunk, because if you add chunks to that setup, the credit and the lava river will go away because chunks and transparent walls don't mix properly. And I've had as many as, I believe, 13 in my map Viaduct. This is Pyroclastic. I submitted this to DLC 1, and it's in there if you want to play it, but I had a much different chunking setup that I believe Revival may have gone back over and put their own custom chunks in with the Unity engine. This is, you know, this has, what, 10 chunks total. You can see down at the bottom here when you recalculate every time. So that's an easy way to know how many spaces you're working with. Generally, you don't want more than about 10. Otherwise, you run into the issue of, you know, a lot of exposure to potential chunk popping. You might get weird reflection probes in small geometries that just doesn't look right. So generally between 2 and 10 is pretty good. Once you're done with this process, I'm not going to show it off because this is outside the scope of the level editor proper. I highly suggest finding, forgive me if this pronunciation isn't right, Arne de Bruijn. His level post tool is very, very useful once you're done with all of this. Once you've created all of these chunks, you can force reflection probes to stay on when the scene is loaded or exported or something like that. Because they're all forced on, that's a little more taxing on your GPU and CPU. It's a little rougher to run on your system, but you won't get nearly as much chunk popping, and you won't get reflection probes getting recalculated when chunks are loaded as you approach them in a level. This is very helpful if you're making a multiplayer map. I highly recommend forcing them all to be on, at least on your multiplayer publishes, if not your challenge modes as well, because they have very similar design philosophies. Anyway, that about wraps it up. We're at about 15 minutes on the nose. I hope this was helpful. If not, don't sue me. But yeah, thanks for watching. Good luck.